Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Hey folks, welcome back to the show. This is your host, Pat Flynn. Today I am joined by my new acquaintance, Christopher Drew, who is going to talk to us about a heresy that we thought was solved a very long time ago, a heresy that St. Augustine himself fought against, but as Christopher has just informed me, he doesn't think it ever really died. We're talking about the heresy of Manichaeism. Before we get into that, Chris, welcome to the show, and thanks for taking the time to chat with me.
Thanks, Pat. I'm glad to be here.
So before we dive, and I'm very interested in the work you've done on this, of how Manichaeism has really kind of shaped the culture and the sort of almost rewoven the moral fabric in many ways. It's a position that I have much sympathy for, and I agree with, and that's why I'm intrigued to pick your brain about some of the work and research that you've done on this. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Chris, if you could just take maybe a few moments to tell us who you are, what you do, how you got into all this stuff, and then we can explore some of your work from there.
Sure, great. My name is Christopher Drew. I've been a student with Holy Apostles for 2.5 years now. Mm-hmm. I finished with all my coursework for my master's, but I still have to do my thesis. This interview is part of one of my last courses that I took with Dr. Mayfood on the new atheism. Mm-hmm. So this is going over, I guess, some of the research that I've done in what John Paul II called the new Manichaeism. So in describing the culture of death and the New Age movement, he brought in these elements into and compared them with the culture we have today. So that's, I guess, a brief overview of what my thesis is covering.
Okay, so awesome. Let's just take a couple more steps back. What is Manichaeism? First off, like how a lot of people are probably not familiar with this, and certainly not its history. So let's get a working definition, if we can, of what exactly we are up against. Sure.
Manichaeism is based on the teachings of a man named Mani, or Manes. He was a Persian, born into poverty, adopted he was born in the 3rd century, died in the middle of the 3rd century. So he was in the middle of Zoroastrianism, the teachings there. Christianity has started to become a formidable a doctrine that was spreading pretty fast in the underground sects of Persia, in that area. So he was familiar with Judaism, and he incorporated this into his Zoroastric Gnostic beliefs. Mm-hmm. He actually stated that he was the embodiment of the Holy Spirit. Mm-hmm. When Christ said he was going to send his Paraclete, Manny decided that's who he was. So he said he was going to, when he was 12 years old, he was visited supposedly by an angel, and the angel's sister, supposedly. Mm-hmm. So, and they explained the difference, the duality between the light and the dark, lightness and darkness, good and evil.
Yeah, so it is a dualistic religion like Zoroastrianism, and it kind of, I guess the easiest way to describe it is I often call it a Star Wars philosophy. Like you have two different sides of the Force, right? The light and the dark, and maybe one isn't necessarily good or the other isn't necessarily evil. They're perhaps two different perspectives. I think there's a couple different ways you can get at it, but I know the important thing to note is a dualistic philosophy, and it's something that has kind of a deep roots of intermixing with the Christian religion in a number of regards. It's morphed into or been the cause of certain heresies. Augustine has an interesting philosophy with it. But what are the relevant details that we need to know about Manichaeism aside from what we just covered to get into the work that you've done, Chris, and how this resurgence of this type of thinking has really affected our culture today?
Well, looking at the mythology of it, that's the interesting part. A lot of the aspects remind me of other religions we have today. Mormonism is one of the big keys that have a lot of the same elements. But Manichaeism is different than the other Gnostic religions because it says that the difference between light and dark are both completely separate. Completely separate realms, two different God figures, both are eternal. Whereas Zoroastrianism and Gnosticism says that there's one God with the duality.
Yeah,
much like Taoism, Hinduism, where there's the good and evil, but there's one ultimate being who's either neither or both. Where Manny decided there were two different eternal beings, one the Father of Greatness and the other the King of Darkness. The King of Darkness saw the light and actually envied it and wanted some of it and decided to attack the light to try to conquer it and take it. But since they were pretty much both equal, it ended up in he made the physical universe all matter, and it actually captured some of the light, some of the fragments of light in the physical. So anything that Manny says, anything that's beautiful, that's animated, has a fragment of light in it. So you see a lot of the elements he took from Christianity. Satan being the angel that envied God, that wanted to take over and take his role, could do things better, and attacked and ended up creating chaos. So that's what that is. But the differences between the Manichaeism belief system is they saw the physical as being evil because it came from the darkness, and the spark of light that's in all animals and plants as being part of the light. And since we have that spark, divine spark, the fragment of light, however you want to state it today, we're drawn to both. There's kind of you wake up in the morning one day, it's bad, you're on the dark side. You wake up the next day, you're in a good mood. You're being nice. Your wife's saying good things about you. You're focused on the light. They're driven by the light. So
definitely a lot of material in this worldview that Hollywood could use and certainly has used in many different forms. So it'll be interesting for listeners to kind of go through a lot of pop culture and be like, oh, okay, that actually sounds a lot like Manichaeism in some ways.
That's a lot. There's Scientology actually incorporates a lot of the mythology into its religion. But like I said, the Mormons have their aspects of it. The brothers Jesus and Satan, Lucifer, battle each other for ruling over mankind. So that there's elements still that haven't died out about Manichaeism. Manny, though, on the other hand, said that he wanted to keep the body pure and like starve it from giving it what it wants. Mm-hmm. So that's the aspect that's changed. The aspect of there is a separation between body and spirit, much like the Jewish religion has today, not ancient Judaism, but more today. Mm-hmm. The separation of the two, where he, to the point where his priests couldn't procreate. They had a ruling class of priests. They had a middle class that taught, and more like our deacons, I guess you'd say. Yeah. Perform things in the world, get married, but were limited in what they can do. And then they had the lower class, that people that just tried to be good and follow his teachings. So that aspect is not, as far as staying pure, it has been, I guess, diluted to the point where the body is still seen as physical, is still seen as evil. Therefore, you can do whatever you want and just blame it on the dark.
Yeah. So it kind of removes a certain moral responsibility, or even
completely.
Yeah, completely. So, and all right, let's get into that. But first, I'm curious to hear of some of the connections that you've made. Like, how did this start to happen? Specifically, bringing it more to the present day, or tracing it back to American culture in general. How did this start to become prevalent within a relatively, Judeo society? It was founded on Judeo-Christian values. How did this start to creep in, and in what ways did it kind of begin to gain hold and traction and become the pervasive influence that it is now?
Well, actually, it's funny you say that, because it's always been an aspect. Manichaeism actually was bigger at some points in history, in the early, during the times of the early church, and in some parts of the world, bigger than Christianity. Mm-hmm. It was probably the first world religion, because it spread all the way from the Middle East, all the way as far east as China, mm-hmm. and all the way as far north as the United Kingdom. So and everywhere in between. So it was huge. Christianity ended up taking over, because we mentioned you mentioned in the beginning St. Augustine for 10 years practiced this as well. Yeah. Until St. Ambrose pulled him out, led him to the Catholic Church. But,
so I think that's kind of an interesting story. What was it that kind of convinced him? Like what was there a big aha moment there where he realized, okay, this Manichaeism, this just cannot be right. I need to become Catholic.
No, it was actually a process. They St. Ambrose and him had many discussions, and it took a couple of years for him to have logical discussions on, hey, this can't be, mm-hmm. And figuring out the logic of it instead of the emotion, that it was the truth. Now, St. Augustine had a different reason for wanting to go into Manichaeism than just logical. Mm-hmm. People think today that it was just seemed logical to him. He wasn't the best of people at the time. I'm sure you read plenty on it when he started out. His mother was praying for his soul. Mm-hmm. That he liked women very, very much. Mm-hmm. So once he got, I think it was about age 20 when he entered Manichaeism, because of the purity they taught of the body and the soul, he was almost feeling so guilty about the few years before and the womanizing that he wanted to go the other direction. Mm-hmm. So it was, I guess, he would have said at the time, it was the light drawing him to the good. So it was, looking back, it became a stepping stone to Catholicism.
Yeah.
So it took him a few years because he was so entrenched in it that he felt so emotionally attached to Manichaeism that it wasn't just a logical step for him.
Yeah, and I think that story is so salient today because even in my own experience, I was I'm a revert, and I was somebody who went through my own periods of atheism, agnosticism, and then a religious pluralism. So I can very much relate, I think, to what Saint Augustine went through, and I think hopefully we see many people kind of use these various dualistic philosophies and religions and neo-paganism that's floating around society today. One would hope, if there's any good to come out of them, that they may serve as stepping stones to the Catholic Church, either as a return to it or an introduction to it in some capacity. And that's why I like his story. I think it's so relevant today. So Chris, okay, so this never went away. It was a huge thing for a long time. Keep taking us along here. What else do we need to know between the history of it and how it started to affect our culture?
Sure.
Now, yep.
Well, once St. Augustine saw the light and I guess converted to Roman Catholicism, again, he felt that emotional connection to prove Manichaeism wrong. So a lot of his writings, you see it in The City of God, a lot of his writings are actually to counter Manichaeism. All his writings on original sin, on the body and soul having both being immortal, was a concept that no religion had taught before. Mm-hmm. They had only taught that the spirit was immortal. So in him countering Manichaeism in his apologetical arguments, he actually helped define a lot of the doctrines of the Catholic Church. Mm-hmm. So it took a lot of the writings that were of the fathers of the church at the time and put a lot of more detail, put the philosophical spin on it. And so he was, I guess, the father of the downfall, but it still took 10 centuries for it to officially go away. Manichaeism wasn't eliminated until about the 11th century in France.
But as we know, it obviously wasn't completely eliminated, or at least the basic tenets or kernels of it were not completely done away with, because as you say, we're dealing with something or some things very much like Manichaeism today. So what happened?
The Enlightenment. Man decided that he didn't need God, that he could be his own God. Mm-hmm. So the Enlightenment showed us that by our own intellect, we can decide what's right and what's wrong. Mm-hmm. We can decide where we're going. And with science splitting from theology and philosophy and going its own direction, it became the new religion for the people who were pushing away from not just the Catholic Church, but religion altogether.
Yeah.
So the adoption of the aspects of Manichaeism, as far as biology goes, they decided, well, if there's not a God, I can do whatever I want. Not just morality, but biology as well. Mm-hmm. So in doing that, all the experiments came about, the ethics were thrown out the window, as well as the humanistic aspects of being just humanitarian to people, that was thrown out the window as well. So those aspects of the body and the physical being evil gave way to the scholars and intellects deciding that, well, we can do whatever we want.
Yeah.
Morals, now everything is seen as evil. Anything's okay.
Yeah. So, I mean, the Enlightenment is certainly a whole tangled web of its own. And, I mean, all the way from Kant and so forth. So, I mean, are there any one particular hinge points or thinkers during the Enlightenment that you think were particularly notorious for at least laying the foundations for something like the Manichaeism philosophy to resurge in some particular way? Chris, I'm asking, is there anybody that we can blame for this? Don't we all just like to point the finger and blame? Can you give us the satisfaction of that, or is that too simplistic?
Well, no, it's actually not. You have to break it down into the various sciences. Copernicus with astronomy, then chemistry. Like I told you at the beginning, I'm terrible with names, but yeah, this sparked not just the division between science and theology / philosophy, but it also started divisions of the sciences. So before there was just physics and philosophy and mathematics, and that was pretty much the sciences.
Yeah.
Well, you had astronomy, astrology, separation from the rest of the sciences, biology, any of the sciences that started then, early stages of psychology. Each one of those had its own, I guess, leader, founder, like Copernicus with astrology, but they incorporated that sense of the new atheistic understanding of, well, if there's a spiritual aspect, we don't care about it. And since we're a physical dimension, we're just going to do what we want. And which is true today. Secular society, we see it. Pornography, drug addictions, anything that you want to do, anything goes. And it's not just the immoral aspect, it's the anti-humanitarian aspect as well. Sex trafficking. We can do what we want to whomever. So.
Yeah, it really is true. Is where you see a decline in Christianity, you see a rise in paganism. I think that's exactly what's happening today and has been going on for a while. So the history is really interesting. I think it's important to understand is like natural law theory at least survived and was strong, lived on long enough to at least sort of suffuse the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and the moral fabric of our country. Even if people like Locke weren't really all on board with it, were they? And so it's a really curious type of thing, and I think you're right. It's really hard to kind of pinpoint it or dial it in to just like where did things really start to go wrong. I don't know. It's something that I've always been interested in. I really like the perspective and the work that you've done on it. So clearly things have gone wrong. Like that's not in dispute. And maybe we could look around forever and try and, shovel the blame on one particular person or series of persons or institutions or ages or whatever. And maybe that'll be productive. Maybe it won't. But taking it here and now, we've clearly got a big moral problem on our hands. And the interesting thing is okay, like atheism has gained a bit of a resurgence, especially with the new atheists. But really it seems like when you dig into the research, and Chris, I'm curious if you've done this as well, is it's not so much that people are becoming less religious. It seems as if really they're just becoming more religiously diverse. And it's a lot of this, and I think you're absolutely right. It's a lot of this kind of Manichaeism types of religions, these pagan religions. You have this thing like Burning Man. You see this really weird thing where people go into the desert and there's like orgy tents and stuff like that. Right?
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah, man.
Exactly.
So it's like, no, like, it's like people aren't becoming atheists. Like there's that God hold, right? There's like, people still understand that, like, okay, this, like, clearly we're not going to commit to the utter absurdity of atheism, but, whatever Christianity, that's like the stuff my grandparents believed in. But this Burning Man seems pretty cool because it lets me be spiritual, but totally, not have any type of moral obligation at the same time. One could see how that might be appealing to youngsters.
Yeah, actually, that's back in the '60s. The New Age movement, the Age of Aquarius, became one of the founding belief systems in the West that just grabbed hold of the youth. The liberalism of being free, of not having to account for any of your actions, and not having to apologize for anything you've done. Yeah, it's actually, that's one of the aspects of New Age, which comes out of Eastern religions, which was influenced by Manichaeism, as well as, you mentioned paganism. Sorry, let me.
No, you keep going, and then I'll come in with my question.
Okay, yeah, I wanted to put the blame, at least. You mentioned Christianity as far as people being less religious, or not so much less religious, but less Catholic, I guess. We can lay the blame squarely on one person's shoulders, Martin Luther.
Yeah, I wonder who that is.
Yes, because he didn't just open the door for all of the different denominations. He actually, by sola fide, by sola scriptura, he opened the door for the Manichaean beliefs to creep into the church.
He really opened the door for relativism, didn't he? Right? I mean, like, maybe not like in such a straightforward way, but I think that there is an argument that can be made with sola fide that, this, and I think we have hard empirical evidence, like now, of the however tens of many thousands of denominations of Christianity they are, that this was that he was just wrong. he was just wrong on just about every account. But like, it's just like, oh man, if it's just whatever you're going to make it, and there is no really objective authority or standard of truth here, I think one could see that he may have well, at least sort of created a certain leaning in a direction that has led to the very relativistic culture we have today. I'm just going to throw that out there. Maybe it will stick or not.
No, I've heard the argument many times. There's a lot of scholars that do put the emphasis on relativism, but I don't think it's so much of that's such a broad term. But if you're speaking of denominations, it's not based on relativism. Take Baptists, for instance. The once saved, always saved. Your baptism is your initiation as a conscious adult, not as a child. So those aspects, you can't join the Southern Baptist Church and go in and say, well, I don't believe this, or I don't believe that. Then you're not Baptist. Yeah. So the relativism doesn't fit when you're talking about specific denominations. Calvinism, as far as predestination goes, it doesn't fit. But you're right, as far as it did open the door where this is true for me, therefore this is true and you're wrong. Whereas relativism is this is true for me and that's true for you. So that's a very nice distinction. I like that. I think that's exactly the way to think about that. And then now, obviously, we do have the strong form of relativism and postmodernism, and the hideous child of that, the social justice movement, and sure, liberalism.
Yeah, and so all right, maybe we can get practical here, Chris. I'm a New Ager. I've read a lot of spiritual books. I don't buy your Catholicism. I don't buy sin. There's no real right or wrong. There's just whatever. It's just whatever, man. Why am I wrong? Right? How do you start that conversation with somebody, Chris? Because you've done a lot of work in this, and I know you must have had these conversations, and you probably had somebody say something to you, as I have, that probably wasn't all that different than what I just said. Right?
Oh no, many times. I've had. It's funny how apologetics turns into debates and arguments, whether you want it to or not. Mm-hmm. I've been in circles where it's been 10 against me, all New Age, and the easiest thing is once you start asking what is truth, then you start getting to their actual motives. Mm-hmm. And that's where you have to break it down. When they tell you that what's true for you is not true for me, what they're saying is I don't feel like I want to believe you. Mm-hmm. It's not I don't think I want to believe you. It's a feeling. Yeah. That's what our society is pretty much running on today. That's the aspect of the monotheism, that you can do what you want, not just if it's immoral, but because everything is evil, I'm just going to stick to my individual narcissistic self. Mm-hmm. So once you start asking what is truth, is there an absolute ultimate truth? The arguments break down from there. They can't tell you, well, if it's true for you, it's true for me. Then it's not truth. Mm-hmm. So you have to get them to explain what is truth, and then you have to get them, okay, tell me what word you want to use for an absolute understanding of this is right and everything else is wrong. Mm-hmm. Once you do that and start defining terms, then it's easy to have a conversation where they can see logic, if they're open to it.
And I like that approach, because you're not starting on a particular, which is often not productive, right? You're not starting on the doctrine of sin or necessarily the resurrection of Christ or the authority of the magisterium or anything like that. Like that, it's easy to get lost in the weeds there. You're starting at sort of the either the lowest or the highest level, depending on how you think about it. And I like that approach. It's really good because, I mean, it's really hard if you're in this kind of New Age camp, this neo-pagan, manichaeistic, whatever, spiritual but not religious, I think is another way of sort of gathering this group of people together under a certain term.
Yep.
Like what are you going to do with that? And certainly I think I share similar experiences with you. Is when you start at the conversation of what is truth, or also what is morality, I think that's another kind of good opener. Have you ever so kind of focusing in on that, seeing where things kind of break down along those lines? And the reason I bring this up, Chris, is because I know that there's going to be a lot of people listening to this who have friends that we are describing them exactly. Maybe they hear, pot shots at their Catholicism, their Christian faith all the time. They're not quite sure how to respond to these people after they just went and read, Eckhart Tolle's latest book. So I think you've given one good strategy from there. What are some other tactics from there that people could take, might want to take, should be aware of? Any other things? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think some of the scholars today, the Catholic scholars, some of the Protestant scholars, they try to focus in on morals and ethics, on where they come from. And they have a good argument and a good base only if the person is actually seeking truth, and two, wants to be moral or see morality crossing cultural boundaries. Mm-hmm. If not, especially with the New Age, they just don't care. Mm-hmm. It's hard to show a foundation of morality, where it's easier to show a foundation of truth, or at least an understanding of this is absolutely right and this is absolutely wrong. Mm-hmm.
So take us down that path then. Maybe, kind of mock out how the conversation would typically go, and you can idealize it if you want. If you want, that's fine.
Sure.
So okay, you ask this group of people, or maybe one person, what is truth, and maybe some things start to break down. What does the rest of the conversation look like for you?
Some of the specifics I get asked. I haven't had to do this in a few years, but I would be asked, okay, well, if killing is wrong and you're absolutely absolute on life and not taking life, then how do you justify war? Mm-hmm. That's a big New Age thing, especially in the '60s. The anti-war movement was pulled directly out of the New Age understanding of, okay, if everything's evil, it's fine, but why would you kill somebody else and live yourself? Mm-hmm. How can you say that they're so bad that they deserve to die, whereas your truth doesn't convict you for death? Mm-hmm. So if people ask me, or used to ask, if you're Catholic, then what about the Crusades? Huge question. I'm sure you've gotten it before. Mm-hmm. Where death and destruction followed, and a lot of good people did some bad things, but overall it was a good movement. And I have to explain that that's the difference right there. It's because you're calling, we're on a simple plane of the physical. Mm-hmm. And there's a whole other dimension that Catholics believe is the spiritual. Mm-hmm. So you have to find the balance between both. It's not this is more important than this. The soul is not more important than the body. God created both and put them together. They're both equally divinely made. So one is not over the other. Mm-hmm. So, and a lot of the New Agers, they have that spirituality, so they can kind of relate to those answers, but they still will focus more on, okay, if you kill somebody, that's wrong. So then you have to ask them, why is killing wrong? Mm-hmm. So you have to go into that. You argue that point, and they say, okay, well, why is killing right? So that's one of the bigger points that came up. I had to argue.
Yeah, and that's interesting because I mean you have that military background, which we didn't quite get into. So that is something that I have not experienced much. I mean, yeah, well, the Crusades, for example, yeah, that is quite common. But talk about war in general is not a typical objection that I have encountered much in my apologetics work. But I like that. I think I think there's an opportunity there to kind of hash these things out on a deeper, more fundamental level. I also like one thing that I'll point out, Chris, is you seem to have tried to establish, and I think this is really important when it comes to apologetics. I try to remind people, look, it's not about winning arguments, it's about saving souls, right? And it's fairly easy to win arguments and really enrage people and have them never want to talk to you again. And what I like about your approach, I think, is the right approach. You're trying to establish common ground. You're trying to find these things that you kind of do agree on and work from there, rather than just wagging the finger or being demeaning or condescending. And like, I get it, and it's hard, especially because so often, especially in the Catholic position, when Catholics are challenged, it's not usually under the most polite circumstance, is it?
No.
So there's a certain test to virtue there, to see how we can not only boldly and strongly defend the Catholic faith, but can we find these apologetic and evangelizing opportunities and make good use of them. And look, I'll be perfectly frank, I struggle with that. It's hard, when somebody comes at you swinging with everything they've got, and to not want to retaliate there, and at least in some relative proportion. Anyway, yeah. Sorry I unloaded a lot there on you, but I like what you're saying. It's got me thinking in a lot of different directions at once.
No, I think it's age that more than passion. That I've had the virtue of patience to tolerate some of the people that come up in your face and are very very aggressive. But yeah, it's really tough to hold back.
So all right. So you've given us some a really good apologetic tactic. Like, let's just talk about truth. Like, what is truth? Can truth be known? How do we know truth? And if we're consistent with this, It's going to get us to God. It's good. It's going to get us to ultimately right to the Catholic Church, as I'm sure both we would argue. But generally, and speaking in terms of society, should we be pessimistic? Should we be optimistic? What is going on here? Can we shift the culture back? Are we losing the culture? Is it already shifting back? It seems like everybody's got a different opinion on this. So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts.
Well, looking back in history, it's going to shift. It's going to ebb and flow. We see the dynamics going on in the church today, where the church is not very liked, or in some places even tolerated, because of the scandals that are going on.
Yep.
Not for the theology, not for the ethics or morals, but for the scandals themselves. Mm-hmm. And that's been that way throughout the last 2,000 years of Catholic history. Manichaeism, even in the 5th century, infiltrated the hierarchy of the church. A lot of the bishops had Manichaeistic views. So we've seen it creep in. Heresy is not new. Modernism is what we contend with today, probably the greatest heresy of them all.
Yeah.
So it's not a matter of can we change it. The answer is no, we can't. That's not a pessimistic view, though. That's only God can change it. Mm-hmm. We have to turn ourselves individually around and point the fingers at ourselves. Was it Chesterton answered the question, what is wrong with the world today? And he responded with, I am. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So basically what's wrong with the church today? The same answer. It's I am. People are so quick to point fingers at, this person or this priest or this lay person or this sin or that sin. And instead of looking at the plank in their own eyes, I think society has influenced us more than we have influenced society. And by that, I mean society has become so selfish and narcissistic and lost its, I wouldn't say moral underpinnings, but basically seeing everything as evil, therefore we can do what we want. Abortion, wars, so euthanasia.
I mean, we really are living in a wicked age, aren't we? And I know Mother Angelica was quite fond of reminding us of the fact.
Yeah, she was. But there's been worse times in history. So this is not one of the. I think this is one of the times that is people are more uncaring. Mm-hmm. Charisma has been drained out of the church to the point where society is just apathetic. Yeah. And I think that is the worst. Is when, like I said earlier, when talking to New Agers, I couldn't reach them unless they cared. If they weren't looking for truth, if they didn't care, they're doing their merry little thing. Leave me alone. I'm not hurting anybody. But yeah, actually, from a Catholic standpoint, they are. They're hurting society and taking it down the drain. Where Catholics and Protestants, I hate to lump those two together, but have allowed this to happen by not standing up for our beliefs and saying, no, there is an absolute truth. There is an absolute moral foundation that society has to have to function.
Well, Chris, this is where I really appreciate you and people like you who are doing the work that you're doing, because I think one thing I guess I'm optimistic about, and that you might have a greater pulse on than me, since you're sort of in the academic world right now is there seems to be something of a resurgence in Catholic apologetics. Would you say that's correct? Do you think that like there's this sort of rise in people who really want to understand truth and as Catholics and want to get out there and argue for it and spread it, or am I just imagining things?
Yeah, I would love to agree with you.
Hmm.
I think the majority of what we see today, scholarly work, the theology dynamics of the laity, the church allowing laity more authority in the work and scholarship. I think, especially with the laity, it's done more out of narcissism, self-pride, than to further the Catholic mission. I think it's a lot of people want to have a name for themselves. They want to take the credit for the things that they discover. Therefore, there's new ideas, new mass, new additions to the rosary. There's all these new things that people are this is mine. I did this, and instead of like looking back at the saints, where that they didn't care if their name was ever known. It's that great calling that the least on earth will be the greatest in heaven. Greatest on earth will be the least in heaven.
Well, that's a really good and important point. Nice one to end on as well. And just to make it a little ironic, I do want to make sure that we give you some credit, my friend. So Chris, I mean, what can we expect from you? Are you working on publishing any work, or people want to know more about you or keep up with some of the stuff that you're doing? Give us all the details there, my friend.
Well, I've done a lot in my 49 years, but a couple of years ago, I got into tinkering around with gear systems, and I have a patent pending right now on a gear system that I'm hoping will be done here in the next 6 to 8 months, and will literally change the world.
Oh, wow. Well, keep us updated on that, especially me.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah. So that's you will hear about it. It's I've got prototypes, patent pending. So yeah, it'll change the world, and that's why I'm hoping to not get my voice out, but get the Catholic voice. I don't care about getting the kudos and all that. I appreciate you, your kind words, but it's not me. It's God in me.
Yeah,
it's Christ living through us, and we can do no good unless we have the Holy Spirit within us.
And to that, I would say amen. Chris, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me, my friend. Let's make the time to do this again.
Thanks, Pat. I appreciate it.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.